Story 1: The Whispering Woods. I used to work as a park ranger in a remote national park in the Pacific Northwest. The park was vast, covering thousands of acres of dense forest, towering mountains, and deep, secluded valleys. It was a place where nature ruled, and human presence was a mere whisper. It was late fall when the incident happened. The days were getting shorter, and the forest was cloaked in a constant mist. I was patrolling a particularly isolated section of the park, an area known as the Whispering Woods. The name came from the eerie sounds that seemed to emanate from the trees, especially at dusk. Locals told stories of ghostly voices and shadowy figures, but I always dismissed them as folklore, until that evening. I had set out on foot, intending to check on a series of remote campsites. It was a routine task, but as the light faded, I felt a growing sense of unease. The forest was unusually quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. My radio crackled intermittently, but the signal was weak from this deep in the woods. As I approached the first campsite, I noticed something odd. The fire pit was still smoldering, but there was no one around. Tent and gear were scattered, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. I called out, but there was no response. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I investigated further. I followed a faint trail leading away from the campsite, deeper into the forest. The path was overgrown, and few people ventured this way. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. As I walked, the whispering began. At first, it was barely audible, a soft murmur carried by the wind. But as I continued, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees. I strained to make out words, but the language was unfamiliar, guttural, and ancient. I tried to shake it off as the wind playing tricks on me, but then I saw her. A figure standing among the trees, barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her long hair hanging in tangled strands. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin had a deathly pallor. She raised a hand and beckoned to me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her lips moving silently. The whispers grew deafening, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. I could feel them probing, searching, trying to force their way into my mind. Desperation gave me the strength to break free. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the cuts and scrapes from branches and thorns. The whispers followed me, growing fainter, but never ceasing. I stumbled upon the campsite, grabbed my radio, and called for help. My voice was trembling, barely recognizable. When my colleagues arrived, I was a wreck. I tried to explain what had happened, but they found no trace of the woman or the whispers. The campsite remained abandoned, and there were no signs of foul play. They chalked it up to exhaustion and stress, but I knew better. I transferred to a different park soon after. The Whispering Woods haunted my dreams for months. The memory of that spectral figure etched into my mind. I never went back, and I never spoke of it again. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear the whispers calling to me from the depths of the forest. Story 2: The Vanishing Cabin. Years ago, I was stationed as a park ranger at a national park in the Rocky Mountains. The park was a place of rugged beauty, with jagged peaks, crystal clear lakes, and dense pine forests. It was also home to countless hiking trails, some well-trodden, others lost to time and nature. One late summer, we received reports of a strange sighting in a remote part of the park. Hikers claimed to have seen a cabin that wasn't on any of our maps. Intrigued and skeptical, I volunteered to investigate. I had always prided myself on knowing every inch of the park, and the idea of an undiscovered cabin was both exciting and unsettling. I set out early in the morning, armed with a map, compass, and my trusty backpack. The trail led me deep into the forest, far from the usual paths. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was strong. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at unseen wildlife. After several hours of hiking, I came across a clearing. There, nestled among the trees, was the cabin. It looked old, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting recent use. My curiosity piqued. I approached cautiously. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin was furnished simply, with a table, chairs, and a bed. An old wood stove sat in one corner, and a single window let in a sliver of light. It looked as if someone had just stepped out, leaving everything in place. I called out, but there was no response. I stepped inside, and a sudden chill washed over me. The air was heavy, and a strange feeling of dread settled in my chest. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. As I explored the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were no personal items, no photographs, no clothing, nothing to suggest who might have lived here. The place felt abandoned, yet inexplicably maintained. I moved to the window and looked outside, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, similar to what trappers and frontiersmen wore in the 19th century. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and piercing. I called out again, but he didn't move. The unease in my chest turned to fear. Something was very wrong. I left to report back and bring others to investigate. As I stepped out of the cabin, the figure disappeared into the forest, melting into the shadows. I hurried back the way I had come, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt as if the trees themselves were watching me. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was exhausted and shaken. I told my colleagues what I had seen, and we returned to the clearing the next day. But the cabin was gone. There was no trace of it, as if it had never existed. The ground where it had stood was undisturbed, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. We combed the area, but found nothing. The reports of the mysterious cabin stopped, and over time, everyone forgot the incident, but me. I left the Park Service a few years later, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me from that clearing. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in the forest. Some nights, I dream of the cabin, of the figure watching me from the shadows. I wake up with my heart pounding, a cold sweat on my brow. I moved far from the Rockies, but I can't escape the memory. Sometimes, I wonder if the cabin still exists, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitor. Story 3: The Lake of Shadows. As a park ranger, I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things, But nothing compares to what I experienced one summer at a remote park in the Appalachian Mountains. The park was known for its serene lakes, dense forests, and winding trails. It was a place where people came to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, to reconnect with nature. But for me, it became a place of nightmares. It started with a routine patrol around a secluded lake known as Shadow Lake. The name was fitting. The water was dark, surrounded by thick forest. It was a beautiful but eerie place, often avoided by visitors because of its isolation. I had been tasked with checking on the area, ensuring the trails were clear and the campsites were in good condition. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. I parked my Jeep and began my inspection, walking along the narrow path that circled the lake. The air was cool, the only sounds the occasional call of a bird and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The birds had gone silent, and a thick fog was rolling in from the far end of the lake. It moved with unnatural speed, enveloping the trees and the water in a dense mist. A sense of unease settled over me, but I continued on, determined to complete my patrol. The fog grew thicker, and visibility dropped to just a few feet. I could barely see the trail ahead, and I had to rely on my flashlight to guide me. The light cut through the mist, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of dread. I felt as if I were being watched, though I saw no one. I came across a small clearing near the water's edge, where I found the remains of an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tents collapsed and covered in mold. It looked as if no one had been there in years. As I inspected the site, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, mournful wailing coming from the lake. I turned towards the water, straining to see through the fog. The wailing grew louder, more desperate. It sounded like a woman in distress. My first instinct was to help, but something held me back. The sound was unnatural, echoing eerily across the lake. I called out, but there was no response. Only the haunting wail. I scanned the shoreline with my flashlight, and that's when I saw her. A figure standing in the shallow water, just beyond the edge of the fog. She was dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair long and dark, hanging in wet strands over her face. She was facing away from me, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I took a step closer, and she moved, gliding through the water without making a sound. The wailing grew louder, and the fog seemed to thicken around her. I felt a chill run down my spine, and a voice in my head screamed at me to run. Ignoring my instincts, I moved closer, trying to reach her. As I stepped into the water, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure turned slowly, and I saw her face. It was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and her eyes locked onto mine with a look of utter despair. The wailing intensified, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. In a last act of desperation, I stumbled back, breaking free from the water's grip. I ran blindly through the fog, my heart pounding in my chest. The wailing followed me, echoing in my ears, until I finally burst through the mist and into the clear air. I reached my Jeep and drove back to the ranger station as fast as I could. I was shaken, barely able to speak. My colleagues listened to my story with a mix of concern and skepticism. We returned to the lake the next day, but the fog had lifted, and there was no sign of the woman or the eerie wailing. Shadow Lake was closed off for the rest of the season, and I was reassigned to a distinct part of the park. I never went back. The memory of that night haunts me to this day. I've tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but deep down, I know that what I saw was something beyond this world. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the wailing again, echoing in my mind. I see her face, her hollow eyes staring into mine. I left the Park Service not long after, unable to escape the fear that had taken root in my soul. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful, but they hold secrets, dark and terrible, that are best left undisturbed.